Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're breaking down a political strategy that really hinges on one critical and maybe fragile assumption that the Supreme Court will be its ultimate safety net. So, the analysis we're digging into today lays out this really complex political architecture for challenging elections. But it argues this whole structure is built on a very shaky foundation, a flawed assumption about the Supreme Court. So let's break down why that foundation might just be built on sand. Okay, so the first big pillar of this whole strategy, it's the belief, the conviction really, that the Supreme Court will ultimately rule in their favor. But the source material we're looking at argues that a recent case, one that has nothing to do with elections, shows why that's probably a massive miscalculation. Now, you might be thinking, what do tariffs have to do with any of this? Well, the analysis points to this March 2026 ruling where the court struck down presidential tariffs. This is key because it reveals a conservative majority that is anything but a unified bloc when it comes to executive power. The source says this wasn't just another ruling, it was a huge signal about the court's limits. Okay, so take a look at this breakdown. This is where it gets really interesting. The composition of that majority vote is fascinating. You see two Trump appointees, Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, joining Chief Justice Roberts and the liberal justices. This was absolutely not a party line vote. It shows a fundamental fracture in the conservative wing, especially when it comes to checking executive power. So why isn't the court a guaranteed rubber stamp? Well, according to this analysis, you have to stop thinking of it as one big conservative bloc. Instead, you've got to see it as three distinct groups, and each one has very different motivations. First up, you've got what the analysis calls the institutionalists. That's Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett. Their number one concern, it argues, is protecting the Supreme Court itself as an institution. They have shown time and again they'll vote against partisan interests if they think the court's reputation is on the line. Then you have the second group, the ideological conservatives, Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. These guys are not reflexively loyal. Their whole legal philosophy is built on things like textualism and separation of powers, which, ironically, often leads them to push back against unchecked executive authority. They're the real wild cards. And that brings us to the final group, the loyalists, Justices Thomas and Alito. Now, the source says that while they're the most reliable votes for the administration, here's the thing. 2 votes is not a majority, it's simple math. And critically, the analysis points out that Justice Thomas's ongoing ethics issues could seriously poison the legitimacy of any ruling he's a part of, making him a potential liability in a case this big. And this quote really gets to the heart of it, right? Chief Justice Roberts' entire career has been driven by protecting the court's reputation. The analysis basically concludes that if he wouldn't risk the court's image for something like tariffs, there's just no way he's going to risk its very survival to overturn a legitimate election. So, okay, the Supreme Court is a long shot, but let's just play this out for a second. Let's say, against all odds, a favorable ruling is somehow secured. Well, the strategy then hits another wall. A huge one, actually. Enforcement. This quote just nails the problem, doesn't it? The Supreme Court doesn't have an army. It has no police force. Its power is basically based on everyone agreeing to listen. And the source argues that in our current political climate, that fundamental agreement, well, it's starting to break down. And this is where we get to a fascinating historical irony, a complete role reversal. As you can see here, historically, the act of defying federal power, or nullification, was something conservative states did. But today, the tables have turned. It would almost certainly be blue state governors in places like California or Michigan who would just refuse to comply with a court ruling they see as illegitimate. And for them, that defiance would be a massive political win. Right, and it's not just the big-name governors either. The source argues that the state and local election officials, the people on the ground who would have to actually carry this out, are no longer willing. They saw the harassment, the threats, the political fallout that people faced before. Now their own self-preservation lines up with one thing: certifying legitimate results. Okay, so the court is shaky and the states won't play ball. But there's a third pillar here that's also crumbling: the voters. The analysis suggests this entire legal strategy is basically a silent admission that the core economic promises made to key voters were broken. See, the whole 2024 win was built on a deal, a pretty straightforward transaction with voters who weren't necessarily die-hard loyalists. Groups like these, they weren't signing up for a culture war. They were promised financial relief and some kind of return to stability. But that's not what happened, is it? According to the source, here is the reality they got instead: economic chaos from tariffs, higher prices at the grocery store, and their retirement accounts taking a nosedive. The deal was broken.
And when you break a deal with voters who were transactional to begin with, the coalition falls apart.
And that's the real gut punch of this analysis. This whole complicated legal strategy, it's not a governing plan. The analysis frames it as a pre-built excuse. It's an escape hatch for when these voters, who were never true believers, understandably walk away.
So let's step back for a second. If the Supreme Court is unreliable, the states won't comply, and the voter coalition is broken, then what is this entire architecture really for?
The source has a name for it, a pre-built excuse machine. It's a fascinating idea, right? It's a strategy that kind of paradoxically succeeds by failing. It gives the base a story about why they lost, which keeps them angry, keeps them donating, and keeps them engaged for the next fight. And that leads us to what might be the single most important point of this entire explainer. This whole thing, it isn't really about the current election cycle. It's about testing the system, finding the weak points, and laying the legal and political groundwork for an even bigger challenge in 2028. Which leaves us with one final and kind of chilling thought from this source. Maybe the most important elections we should be watching right now aren't for the White House or for Congress. Maybe the real fight for 2028 is happening now in these state-level races for governor and secretary of state. Because according to this analysis, those are the people who will have the power to certify or refuse to certify the next presidential election. And that's where the real architecture is being built.